Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Wednesday, December 10th, where we are talking about The Exorcist and coming close to finishing up the semester. Because next week we will talk a little bit about Stephen King, his short stories this time. We began the semester with talking about Dance Macabre, and we have our final exam after that, and that will be the very last class of the semester. And that would be the very last day that you could submit in any outstanding assignments. And what I will be doing is posting the final examination next week on Wednesday at the time our class would normally meet at 8 a.m. And you will have 24 hours in which to complete that final examination. If we were taking the exam in a face-to-face situation, you would have approximately 2 hours. So that's about as long as you should spend on the examination, 2 hours. And even though you're getting 24 hours, and I realize that anything you do won't be as neat or developed or polished as a piece of writing for a paper, and I don't expect that. It'll just be a series of essay questions, and you'll have choice within them. It'll be open book, open notes, and basically it's an opportunity for you to synthesize some of the major points of the semester that we've been discussing. And as you know, I tend to like to ask questions that don't necessarily have clear cut right or wrong answers. That basically these are questions that ask you to support positions based on evidence, things that can be debated. So that will give you a little bit of a sense as to what the final is, but the best way to prepare for it is to, well, have read everything, watched all of the class videos, and basically, again, it's just sort of synthesizing everything. Again, reviewing the class discussion forums and my responses to those forums, as well as your peers' responses. You'll get a good overview of the semester as a whole. And obviously, The Exorcist is a very different kind of text than the text we've been talking about thus far. We began with talking about some pretty traditional texts when we were talking about Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. And then we moved forward to some more contemporary texts, much like The Haunting of Hill House. But The Exorcist really is in a position that is unique. And we began The Exorcist by talking about how it became literally a cultural phenomenon, and that individuals, there were news reports of responding quite vehemently to this particular film for a host of reasons. Part of the reasons is probably the time period. We're talking about the 1970s, which was a time period of some very um, clear-cut drug use, and I suspect that people would oftentimes come to the theater under the influence. So seeing these images in film, and this was a New York Times bestseller, and the text is very, very close to the film because the author of the text worked with the director of the film. This is unusual in terms of what we've seen with previous adaptations, which oftentimes take a great number of liberties. Probably the biggest liberty that the film takes is that it deletes some of the subplots or simplifies some of the subplots for the sake of time more than anything else. The film utilized all kinds of techniques, many of them subliminal, to disorient and disturb viewers. And they were auditory and they were visual, and all of those, as well as just the changes in volume, where sometimes it can go from very silent to very loud. Again, we're meant to disturb and disorient viewers. And of course, the subject matter, no one had seen anything quite that graphic before. Of course, by today's standards, it might not seem necessarily graphic, but The Exorcist led the way for film and also text to be as graphic as possible to try to outdo what had been previously done. Stephen King called it the gross out. And certainly, I think we see that with The Exorcist, with the very explicit scenes, whether they be written out or filmed, of the exorcism, as well as the possession that is occurring with Reagan McNeil. However, I've always said that the film and the text have been misread and misunderstood. The title is about the exorcist, not necessarily the person who is possessed. And if we read the film and we read the text from that particular perspective, I think what we'll see is that all of these characters are haunted or possessed, if you will, by guilt for various reasons. And that gets us back to our initial premise when we were talking about paper topics, that one need not be a chamber to be haunted. So, in terms of thinking about this text and film, in terms of how it made history, or one of the ways that it made history, it was the first horror film nominated for the Best Picture, and it was nominated for 10 Academy Awards. It won Sound and Best Adapted Screenplay. The reviews, they call this a supernatural mystery story, which I think is a good way of describing this text. And we know that there's a lot of genre blending between the Gothic genre and the mystery story. The opening quotes in the book are about biblical evil because there is a long history of possession um, from biblical times, and equating that to human evil. And I think that really is also one of the cruxes of this particular text, is that the evil that human beings and can in one way or another create is just as horrific, if not more so, than biblical evil. And then there's that prologue, which confused audiences who were watching the film, and even confused audiences who were reading the text in Iraq. And Iraq is reputedly the site of the fall of man, that this is where the Garden of Eden was. So this is already establishing the religious element of the film. And maybe again, that's one of the reasons why so many people responded so vehemently and violently against the film, is because it really hit some cultural nerves about religion and spirituality. And we know that our main character, or one of our main characters, one of the exorcists, I should say, Father Merrin, has a premonition about evil. And as we know, Gothic texts oftentimes have ambiguity. This text too could have ambiguity, but this prologue would seem to suggest that the events are more than physical or psychological, that there is some sort of supernatural element. Marin is almost kind of like a Van Helsing figure from Dracula, if you think of it, where he's able to merge science, he's an archaeologist, with religion, he's a Jesuit priest. And we have Marin, as much as he is a man of the faith, engaged in his own sin, where he's basically removed himself as much as possible from the base so that he could work with academia. And we will see something similar with Father Karras as well. There is a reference to occurred with rotting teeth, and about how one needs to exhibit Christianity by loving the base, and at least through action, if not through feeling. And Pazuzu, which is a central star of the text, is a demon of sickness, disease, and the Southwest, which is what we think is uncovered. Of course, we can see this as well from a symbolic standpoint, that this is evil that has been unburied, much like Edgar Allan Poe talks about trying to bury evil. And we see the sunset, and this is suggestive of a descent. And then we move to Washington, D.C. And if there was ever a parallel between evil, it's probably the American counterpart to Iraq, and the Garden of Eden would be for us Washington, D.C., and the place of perhaps lies. And even though this isn't necessarily a literary text in the way that the other texts that we've read have literary elements, I still think that William Peter Blatty is able to use literary elements. Right at the beginning, he talks about how the house is gripped by ivy, and this gives you a sense of claustrophobia that's evident within the text. The events begin on April 1st. This is evil with a sense of humor, and we see the generation gap, which would have been a huge issue during the time period, through Chris McNeil, who is filming a campus protest film, and this gives you an idea about some of the chaos and the turmoil that was going on during the time period. She says something quite telling, that you need to be able to work within the system to enact change, and this is something that Father Marin is also going to find, and Father Karras, actually. I meant to say Father Karras when he is asking for permission to perform an exorcism. And of course, there are rules that need to be followed within the church in order to be able to do that. Chris might seem like the poster child for a victim of the devil. She is an atheist. She is divorced. She's a wealthy actor. Definitely the idea of class and privilege is examined in this text. Perhaps that's one of the greatest evils of our society. The very rich and the very poor side by side. When we see that with Father Karras's mother, where she is basically close to destitute, as opposed to Chris, who is living a life of luxury and talking about traveling to Europe and buying horses for her child. And Sharon, and they simplify this particular character in the film, is engaged in transcendental meditation. And certainly at the time period, there were questions about how things like transcendental meditation might perhaps open up a doorway to spirituality, a doorway that you wouldn't want to open. Dennings, another character who is somewhat simplified in the film, is obviously an alcoholic. Alcohol is his demon, if you wanted to think about it that way. He engages in a great amount of profanity. That'll be important in the sense that Reagan McNeil is overhearing this, and perhaps she's learning some of this profanity. Keep in mind, people weren't surfing the internet during this time, so it would be viewed at the time that a girl of her age, this would be horrifying, that she would be engaged in language and behavior like this. And she's 11 years old. She's on the cusp of being 12. And if you remember, we talked about poltergeist activity, how that was oftentimes centered on female puberty. And definitely what we've got is Reagan McNeil illustrating the possibility of that. And one could say that some of the events are, or perhaps all of the events, are the result of poltergeist activity. And there's missing clothes in the house and moved furniture, and she also is using a Ouija board, and we know from The Haunting of Hill House some of the folklore associated with that. And she's using the Ouija board by herself, which is always viewed as a dangerous thing to do, because you are again opening up the possibility, or possibly opening up a portal that could not be controlled, and in fact that can't control you if you're there solo without another individual. um, Father Karras is a boxer, very appropriate, because he is going to be fighting the fight of his life, if you will. And he's lost his faith. And again, what a wonderful subject for the devil, a priest who's lost his faith. And that's part of what this text is about. It's about faith, it's about redemption, it's about sacrifice. And definitely it portrays Christianity as savior. And Karras, too, is struggling with how to love the base. You remember when he is going to visit his mother, he sees a derelict and he's repelled by it, even by it as how he thinks of the derelict, not even as a him. And it gives this derelict money. And at least in the text, we see him give him money that he had saved for himself for a cab. Already, we're beginning to see a sense of sacrifice. Again, Marin talks a little bit to Kara, so that it's less about feeling this and more about action, about showing Christian fellowship, which is what is illustrated here in that small episode. And we see Father Marin's, or Father Karras's mother, who is lonely and poor in the Bronx. And of course, he has sacrificed himself for the cloth, which means that even though he has an incredible pedigree where he's attended Ivy League institutions, and he is also a man of science, of psychiatry, but he also is a man of the cloth. He's found a way to merge science and religion. The day after Reagan's 12th birthday is when the events escalate. Personality changes, lying, insomnia. These could be physiological episodes, these could be psychological episodes. We know that Reagan comes from a broken family, which at the time period that would raise some eyebrows. And we know that her friend, well, on the Ouija board or with her Ouija board usage, like Captain Howdy, sounds a lot like her father, Howard. Or the events could be supernatural, and might I suggest that perhaps all three are the case, much like I had suggested something similar with The Haunting of Hill House. It doesn't have to be one or another. And I had you watch the film up until the point where we began to see some church desecrations. This is where the film becomes particularly graphic. You might have elected to see more, but if you decided to stop at that point, I think you got a good sense as to what was happening in the film, particularly after reading the book and the parallels between the two. And the book, too, is rather explicit. And I had suggested that if you're getting to very explicit passages in the book and you're uncomfortable, you can just skim through them. They're there, I suspect, more for shock value than anything else, because again, our focus really should be on Karis Marin and not necessarily on Reagan MacNeil. Mrs. Perrin is a character in the text who basically is a seer and feels very uncomfortable with Reagan, and Reagan won't talk with her or shake her hands. There's references to the occult and seances, a loss of bodily functions, and perhaps that's one of the ways that horror is horrific when one is no longer in control. And we talked about the idea of Hill House taking away autonomy, and we definitely see a loss of autonomy physically with the scenes of possessions. And we're given religious quotes throughout the text, such as that one can get wisdom through the awful grace of God. There will be this idea of testing individuals. Karis's mother is ultimately taken to an insane asylum and will die alone. And we see the loneliness of priests in this text, which would have seemed revolutionary for the time period. This was before all of the church scandals were released in the media. But the idea to see priests portrayed as human with flaws would have been very unusual during this time period. And we see Reagan's deterioration, which happens quite fast. Also, around the same time, where there's a book that is in the household about devil worship that disappears. One could say that Reagan is the one who takes that book and reads that book and is able to utilize the information from that book throughout the course of the novel. She begins speaking backwards, which, of course, there's a question, is that another language? Because speaking in tongues is supposed to be one of the symptoms of possessions. Her body contortions, which again could be tremors or could be physiological, but they also seem to defy natural explanation. Incredible amounts of sexuality, which again, for a young girl, would have seemed shocking and stunning for audiences. Animal noises influencing the idea that Reagan has descended into the bestial and that all humanity really is closer to the bestial than it would like to admit. And Burke is ultimately killed, and the staircase is quite famous. If you saw some of the documentaries that I had asked you to see, they talk a little bit about that staircase, which has become a tourist attraction. And of course, the central mystery of the text is, could a little girl, in effect, a 12-year-old Reagan MacNeil, have killed Burke, pushed him out the stairs, particularly if she had the strength of the devil, if she was indeed possessed. When they hypnotize Reagan, what is found is that there's some sort of entity that says that it hates Reagan and it wants to punish her. There's a wonderful scene that was deleted from the original film that was reinserted in the director's cut, and it's about Father Marin and Kara speaking with one another during the possession when they're taking a break and talking about the purpose of possession. And this is when Father Marin says that the purpose of possession is not to torment the possessed, but it's to torment the individuals around the possessed person and to have them question their faith. So I think we definitely see this idea in the film version with the cuts that were made, but it's explicitly stated in the textual version. We get a homicide detective. His name is William Kinderman because he is a kinder man. He ultimately has suspicions about Reagan's involvement in Burke's death, but at the ending of the novel decides to let things be because Reagan has been quite ill. He has some interesting dialogue about youth culture and drug use and abuse during that time period. And again, the 1970s and 1960s were known for their drug culture elements. And one could say that Reagan McNeil is acting as if she were under the influence. And I suppose that from a contemporary parallel, there were many parents who were struggling with children who seemed monstrous all of a sudden and uncontrollable. And that gets back to the idea of the generation gap, but certainly much more so than that, that one could be afraid of one's child. And those issues are embedded within The Exorcist as a commentary about the time period itself. And as the church desecrations continue, Reagan continues her descent, and Chris lost one of her upcoming movies entitled Hope. That's not such a subtle reference to the idea that obviously Chris McNeil is losing hope about what's happening. And her servant, Carl Engstrom, this is a plot element that is simplified in the film, is an ex-felon that he is actually responsible for drug theft. He was supplying drugs to his drug-addicted daughter. So again, that subtext about drug addiction and youth being addicted to drugs and outside substances and acting as if they were possessed is very much illustrated in the text itself. And when we get more biblical quotes in book 3, notice how this text is divided into multiple books. Chris is begging Karis for an exorcism, and Reagan is very much portrayed as the other or this thing that is possessed by the devil. The demon taunts Karis, and perhaps the best way to torture someone is to torture them with truths and half lies. And the demon says that he knows Karis's mom is dead, but won't reveal her maiden name. So the question of doubt and how does one have faith in the face of doubt is very much illustrated. Could this be poltergeist phenomenon is one of the things that Karis is wondering about. Could this be physiological? That's another thing that Karis is wondering about. Many people have said that some of the most frightening episodes of the film are not the possession scenes, but the medical scenes where Reagan is being examined by the medical community, where ultimately the scenes are rather graphic, and seem almost barbaric, though this would have been cutting edge technology for the time period. Um, Both Chris and Damien Karras are in pain. They're haunted by their own demons. Chris about how she's put her career above her family and that now she is a single mother. And of course, Damien Karras with the idea that he chose the church over his mother. And the demon says quite directly, we have to give you some reason to doubt, which of course is one of the things that haunts Father Karras. He uses tap water, pretending that it's holy water, to see how the demon or Reagan McNeil will respond, and the response is quite violent. But there is a difference, and that difference is explained to us that tap water is not blessed by a priest, which is what holy water is. And then the demon even talks about the quote embarrassment over the holy water incident. Again, this is a demon that likes to taunt and tease and has a rather, if I may, devilish sense of humor. And this is when we discover the speaking in tongues, so to speak, and speaking backwards, which may or may not be speaking in tongues. Words on the skin that it mimics pleas for help help me. And this is where ultimately Karras believes that there's enough evidence to warrant an exorcism, even though there's still doubt. His faith is increasing. Karras has been looking for a sign, and this is the sign. Now, it's quite convenient that Chris McNeil's home is right next to a religious institution, but again, what better place for the devil to choose a victim? A single mother who is an atheist who happens to be in close physical proximity, as well as a priest who has lost his faith and is also in close proximity. And of course, the idea is that when Father Merrin is summoned, he already knows this. This gets us back to Iraq and the premonition that he had. And in our last book, the opening quote about the power of love and how that can defeat evil. And we find out the origins of Karras's first name, Damien, who was a priest and devoted to caring for lepers, and he caught the disease himself and basically succumbed. There's a little bit of foreshadowing of what Karras is going to do when ultimately the demon enters into Father Karras, and what he ends up doing is committing suicide or sacrificing himself, almost like a Jesus figure sacrificing himself for humanity. Karras sacrifices himself for Regan McNeil and the McNeils as a whole. The climax, that battle of good versus evil, is one of the reasons why the church actually didn't necessarily condemn this film, because it did portray evil as a possible entity that could be defeated by Christianity, which is the whole premise of the Christian religion. And the demon knows how to attack. These are psychological attacks. For Father Merrin, it's his pride that, he's basically escaped his inferiors, the base, so to speak, so that he could bury himself in, pun intended, archaeology and academia. Willie is the drug addict daughter, and that's what Carl is carrying as his basically guilt. Sharon, and this is simplified in the film, but she feels a physical attraction to Damien Karras, who's a priest, so of course that would have been taboo. So that's the guilt that she carries. Chris, as I had indicated, putting her career before her family. And Karras, of course, the guilt of putting religion over his mother. There are some references to biblical possession, and again, the purpose of possession is not to torment the possessed as much as it is the observers, so that they are overcome with despair about the bestial and feel that the world is vile, ugly, and inhuman. And the belief in God is accepting the possibility, at least the way it's portrayed in this text, that God could love us despite all of the bestial and the ugly that exists. And Marin has, again, that long speech that was deleted from the film, where he talks about that he was once repelled by certain people and despaired that he couldn't love them and thought that he had lost his faith. And of course, Father Karras is quite interested in this because Karras feels many of the same things. And Marin says that it's important to act with love, not feel necessarily love in all actions. And I think that this is very important when we are talking about something like the battles that can occur on a daily basis that aren't nearly as dramatic as possession, which is what Father Merrin talks about. The disagreements between friends and lovers, and that those are the true evils, the small evils that add up daily. Nothing as dramatic as the possession that we saw. Marin ultimately dies of a heart attack, and there was some foreshadowing of that, and that we see that he's been taking heart pills and obviously is older. And Karras, when the demon is laughing over the fact that Marin has died, demands that the demon leave the girl and take him. And then, of course, he jumps out the window, and the pedestrians, and I think this is quite important, either ignore Karras or are indifferent to him, assuming that he's just some sort of drunk. And again, I think this illustrates the elements of evil that Father Merrin was talking about that exist on a daily basis, where people have lost the capacity to act with love. And somebody should have not, somebody should have intervened immediately rather than initially just walking past the body that's fallen out of the window and thinking that this wasn't their concern, or that this wasn't something that they should interfere with. Of course, one of the things we see is the friendship that is so important for all of humanity, but especially for priests in a world that is oftentimes quite isolating. And Damien is able to give his last confession to not only another priest, but to his friend, and that he dies with a look of peace and joy in his eyes. So one assumes that he has found his faith, and perhaps he has also found God. And the hope, of course, is that he has moved into the spiritual realm. We have an epilogue that occurs in late June. It makes sense in that we've got a restoration of order where we've got the seasons changing to summer. Of course, in the beginning, we're in the fall, and there is that iconic scene in the film where Chris McNeil is walking and Tubular Bells is playing in the background, and we can see the children dressed for Halloween, and we know how significant of a day Halloween is in the spiritual realm. And Chris talks a little bit about how she does believe in the devil. She may not necessarily believe in God, but as she says, the devil keeps advertising. And it's Father Dyer, who was Father Damien Karras's friend, who's now going to have a friendship with Kinderman. And that's something that we also see in the book, that Kinderman is talking about how he too feels a sense of isolation, even though he's married, but he talks about the importance of community. He's looking for someone to go to the theater with, to see movies with somebody, a companion, if you will. And the idea is that that relationship of Dyer and Kinderman is a way of sort of illustrating the relationship that Kinderman and Damien Karras were beginning to develop. So the attendance question that I had asked is one of those questions that doesn't have a clear-cut answer. And it's about, do you think Regan was possessed, and why or why not? And the author was quite clever to put in enough information to suggest that she is possessed, but also enough information to suggest that she's not possessed. It almost reminds me of a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne that you might be familiar with, Young Goodman Brown, about a man who journeys into the wilderness and encounters this devil-like figure. And the question is, at the ending of the story, is, did the events truly occur, or was it all a dream? And this story is deliberately ambiguous because you'll never be able to come up with a definitive conclusion. And I guess we could say the same with The Exorcist. But it certainly touched a nerve, a spiritual and religious nerve, in a time period where people were much more spiritual and religious. It certainly led to questions about youth counterculture and youth rebellion, which was happening during the time period. It certainly examined some of the social issues that individuals were grappling with and maybe not grappling with, such as income inequality and single parenthood, and how that might be contributing to some of the societal ills in the time. And of course, it was a film that had defied all kinds, and a text, all kinds of expectations. So when we think about um, how tame, let's say, Gothic literature looks in light of some contemporary pieces in today's world, we can see how this film really opened up the floodgates. You might have noticed that the film oftentimes focuses on doorways and also windows. The idea is that these are entrances and exits into the psyche, if you will, as one of the ways of reading this text and reading this film. And in terms of watching film from an academic perspective, you can read it in much the same way you can read a text, which is why we've been talking as much about film as we have been talking about text. Certainly, those iconic adaptations of the text that we've been talking about. So again, your attendance question, which is due Friday the 12th. If you need an extension, please let me know. Of course, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. Do you think Regan was possessed, and why or why not? And we will finish up on Monday by talking a little bit about some odds and ends, and ultimately a couple of Stephen King short stories. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next week, our last week. Take care. Bye bye.